Okay, so today we're going to look at a very specific challenge, which is trying to understand what goes on in the head of an architect as they design a building. And this will be the first of two lectures on this. But first I have to emphasize that my concern here, speaking as a neuroscientist interested in architecture, is not today to say how do I give a set of tools to the architect to do better designs. I'm really trying to say what goes on in the brain of the architect. So today I'm going to set the stage. I'm going to look at Zumthor and Utzon, and I'm going to look at what I think is a bad example of a neurocognitive architecture for analyzing design, and that will set the stage for coming back in week 5 to talk about design and creativity again. But I will claim that the example I show you here is not good enough. I'm setting myself up to see if I can do better. And then the students in the class are doing projects which will continue this theme. So I've suggested some readings. We'll be looking at Peter Zumthor, who has a nice little book called Thinking Architecture, and I want to make a few points based on his first essay. I have an article which I think is relevant in a very nice book called Mind in Architecture and Neuroscience. In Architecture and Neuroscience, edited by Sarah Robinson, who is an architect, American, but now living in Italy, who came up with a conference at Taliesin West, Frank Lloyd Wright's place in Arizona, and Juhani Ballasmaa, who is Finland's leading architectural thinker, and in fact a world leader in essays on architecture. And they edited this book, and I have a chapter there that has some of the ideas. And then my target for I think we can do better will be this paper by Goel called Creative Brains, Designing in the Real World. Now, the last part of my talk is going to focus on the Sydney Opera House by Jørn Utzon, and so I strongly recommend that you download this Discovery Channel type video at www.youtube.com/watchquestionv, etc., etc. But I'm sure if you just type in Sydney Opera House video, without too much trouble you'll find it. And I would just say that if you really want to think about the ideas today, what you might want to do is just watch the thing, take notes, and think about what are the various creative acts that we hear about in this as it goes through. And who did the work? Where was it Utzon's creativity? Where was it the people on the construction site's creativity? Where was it the engineer's creativity? I'll just touch very briefly on that later. But anyway, this is sort of the material available. Now, what is design? The notion is that there is a mental process that we want to try and get a handle on. It creates something. It may undergo revision and editing as we apply local criteria, better perceived patterns, and then the result is available for visual or other inspection or for guiding performance. So if we're designing a piece of work, as in music or a book, then there's in some sense a performance there. Our focus, though, is going to be more on where the final result is, a building that people experience. If we're talking about architecture, there's a continuity, of course, from what you might call the everyday practice of an architect, of the majority of architects, to what you might call the really exceptional works. And we'll be using the Sydney Opera House as our exceptional work today. But as I'm introducing these ideas, what we're trying to do is initiate a dialogue between neuroscientists and the analysis of masterpieces, and this might reflect back into the education of architects who, by thinking about the mental and cognitive neural processes, can get a new handle on what goes on in the design and then the experience of buildings. And what we're going to do in the second half of the talk, when we turn to Utzon, we'll find a particular case study or set of case studies of this one exceptional architectural work, and we'll try to think through what are the cognitive mechanisms engaged, and this might begin, and this is what we'll be coming back to in more detail in week 5, might begin to suggest challenges for something that a neuroscientist or a cognitive scientist might actually want to do by looking at the general understanding of specific processes as distinct from the specific understanding of a range of processes in the actual architectural practice. So this is our setting of the stage. And just one more point, which I won't be developing today because I'll be looking particularly at what happens in the head of one lead architect, but it's very important to understand that in general something like architecture involves what this author Lukisis calls co-designers, and the issue of how in fact on a large project many people elaborate and then share their ideas to invite more elaborations of one part or another. I was talking to Jeannie Gang and her husband, architects in Chicago, and I was amazed, for example, to discover there's a whole specialization within architecture now called elevatoring. If you're designing a skyscraper, just understanding how to get people quickly from one floor to another without taking all the space up with the elevators is a big challenge. So you have many, many different people looking at different aspects of the building, and in the end they converge on the overall design. And in a sense, the Utzon Opera House will remind us of the fact that although we credit Utzon as the designer, he was really only part of the final project. Okay, but before I get to the Opera House, let's talk about this essay of Peter Zumthor's on remembering and imagining. So I'm not, in the case of Zumthor, going to be looking at any of his works in detail. I want to look at this essay of his, which I think gives us some challenges to address from a neuroscience perspective. But I just want to show you one building of his that's very impressive, and just reflect on it for a moment to think about how he got to. Now, in fact, there's a whole book which has many more photos and has Zumthor's essay and other people's essays on this. So, for example, the stone that it's built from is quarried from the region. It's gneiss, G-N-E-I-S-S. So thinking about materials that blend with the landscape, very much the alpine landscape of Switzerland, but in an area with hot springs. How do you build thermal baths? And here is this, you both take advantage of the landscape by framing it. You, as it were, bring the landscape into the building by framing of this kind, by using sod grass on some of the roofs. You're again making it blend more with the landscape. And then there are the different rooms which give access to different springs. And so what's interesting here is that although we're looking at photographs here, we are using this to remind ourselves or introduce ourselves to a multisensory experience. Obviously, when you come into one of these rooms, you immerse yourself in the water. There's the feeling of the water, the temperature of the water. One at least of the rooms has flowers floating in the water, so you bring in the sense of smell. There's one place where you move from one room to another and you have to push aside a heavy curtain, so you bring another tactile element into it, and another way of highlighting the transition from one thermal experience to another. And I speak here on the basis of my son's visit. Unfortunately, I have not been there myself. But this is just to, before we talk about Zumthor as a, if you will, a thinker from his book Thinking Architecture, I thought it would be useful to just introduce this idea of the multisensory experience as you move through and use the building. And I think that gives us a lot of ideas that resonate with the concepts we introduced in the first week together. So here is the man himself. Let's start with function. He's saying, unlike the sculptor, I have to start with functional and technical requirements. So that as an architect, how is the building to be used? So if we think of his one example there, In the end, the function is I've got to make it easy for people to experience the different springs and move from one to another, and probably have to worry about a shower room and a changing room and things of this kind. But that clearly does not constrain very much the way he came up with the final building. And so there was a school of architecture whose slogan was form follows function, but clearly if we just reflect upon the baths at Val's, I think we would agree that it's more that there's a dynamic interaction of considerations of form and function as design proceeds. So that in the end, his building is a great success because it blends with the landscape, it's beautiful, it provides multisensory experiences, and it works well as a place to experience the different springs. So that might be one of the things we want to think about as we move towards a cognitive architecture of design, is how does form get represented, how does function get represented, how do the two interact as design proceeds. Okay, the next thing is construction. This is a very important thing. He, I think, had an apprenticeship in carpentry. But anyway, he's saying construction is the art of making a meaningful whole out of many parts. So it's not enough to just, in general, sketch a beautiful shape. You have to really think through how it's going to be built. And so he says, I feel respect for the art of joining, the ability of craftsmen and engineers, the knowledge of how to make things. And again, we can see radical changes in what that means as we go from wooden structures to brick structures to the rise of steel girders to be able to allow the construction of skyscrapers, to the sort of Frank Gehry stuff where you've got computer design to calculate weird curvatures and put them together, so that there is a continual historical evolution there between form considered in the abstract and form considered in what can be achieved with available technology, and of course in less exalted conditions what can be achieved with available costs. All right, whole and details. If you remember our discussion of visual perception, we had something of this aspect, that you might look at a scene and very quickly know this is a suburban scene or a city scene, or hey, there's the Eiffel Tower there, it must be Paris. But then you go back and forth between rectifying your overall impression and filling in the details. So this idea of the interaction between the stage of the whole and the details is even there in the process of visual perception. But it's the same as you develop a design. So he talks about developing a whole out of innumerable details, and again, that interaction of various functions and forms, materials and dimensions. Details lead to an understanding of the whole, of which they are an intrinsic part. But the point here is that they're evolving together. It's not that you know what the final building will be before you start working out the details. It's not that you have all the details and you just assemble them as you work. The whole determines details. The work on the details modifies the whole until in the end you have a final design in which the whole and the details are congruent. And then the other thing is, of course, the issue of when are the details part of what is just required to make the wall stand up or to provide the doorway and so on, and what about ornamentation? There's the notion of detailing, where even if in some sense you've got an overall form, you may want to come up with further details that provide something of the atmosphere or the aesthetic offerings that the building provides. But the part of his essay that I want to build on to make a few more connections with cognitive science and neuroscience is this quote, when I think about architecture, images come into my mind. Right. So one riff on that before we go on. Often when we use the term image or imagination, we're thinking about visual images. And I think what was very important about our quick look at the thermal baths at Valls in Switzerland was how multisensory it is. You're not just thinking of an image of a visual look. Those pictures were keys to a multisensory experience in which vision, smell, hearing perhaps were combined with action. So in some sense you're putting episodes together, multisensory episodes, and those are the images. I imagine what would happen if I walked through and plunged into this pool, etc., etc. So images come to mind. Now what's interesting though is the crucial point is when I design, I frequently find myself sinking into old, half-forgotten memories. Yet at the same time, I know that all is new and that there is no direct reference to a formal work of architecture. So it's not that he thinks, oh, 5 years ago I had to build a doorway, so let me pull out doorway 173 and plug it in here. He is constructing something new each time. And I think that reflection on our discussion of visual perception again helps us. The idea that, okay, you know how to recognize this, you know how to recognize that, but when you come upon a new scene, your experience allows you to recognize different aspects, but the shapes are different, the relations are different, and so in the end you come up with whatever your representation or your understanding of the scene is from your memories, but the result is new. And the difference here is that instead of mobilizing them in response to a scene, you're mobilizing them in response to a design challenge. Here are some constraints of form, here are some constraints of function. How can I begin to marshal things from my memory which will bring it all together? So this idea of how can memory work not to remember the details of a particular episode. So I say, oh, I remember what I did last week and I tell you about it, but rather I bring up these many different episodes and I'm able to take fragments of them and in some sense assemble them to create a new whole. So this is the process that I think is one ripe for neuroscientists to talk about. And I'll say a little bit about some new data from brain imaging that point in that direction. But that's all I'll do today is point in that direction and perhaps in week 5 come back and fill in some of the details. But just think about language in that sense. We have a vocabulary, but we put words together. If we don't know a language, we don't know what the words mean, we don't know how to put them together. But knowing that, that's part of our memory base, we can say totally new things. And in particular, we can shade the meaning of words. So we actually affect the meaning of words that we've used before by placing them in a novel context that shades them and maybe takes over. So that example of the word of James I calling St. Paul's Cathedral an awful building, and then over the centuries that word awful went from his meaning of awe-inspiring to that meaning of terrible. But of course terrible is also a word that used to mean inspiring terror, not something we just have a bad opinion of. So just the way in which, by being able to bring elements to bear and then reform them in ways that give them new meanings, that creates a totality with even further new meanings, is something that we can get from going back and forth between thinking about architecture and thinking about language. And I'll be doing that right at the end. But let's just have one slide where I try to make one distinction between language and architecture. And that is that in language, we have a lexicon. This is the set of words and their meanings and other properties. And then we have a grammar that tells us how to put them together. So in some sense, unless you're into experimental poetry or things of this kind, when you're using a particular language, you're accepting these are the building blocks, these are the words I can use, these are the ways I can put those blocks together. Whereas architecture as a design process is that, in fact, you may design new building blocks, you may change the lexicon in the process, you may decide to use a new material, or you, as in the example of Geary's development of a technology for putting curved titanium plates together in the Bilbao Museum, and in the same way a new form of construction. So that's sort of parallel. There is sort of a lexicon, there is a grammar, but whereas it's fixed but very flexible in language, the architect may actually be changing for the purposes of a particular building his lexicon and his or her grammar. Okay, so that's the framing. Now let's just look at a few findings from cognitive science and neuroscience that I think can enter into our future discourse on the neuro and cognitive science of architecture. So this is a classic paper by Jerome Kagan of Harvard back in 1970, where he looked at young children and he looked at their attention, how long they would look at a stimulus. And when they were a week old, an infant would just as soon look at these messed up figures as look at the actual faces. But as time went by 4 months old, looking at a face would capture the child's attention more than one of these scrambled images. And moreover, though, and that's crucial, is that if the child had watched a number of different faces, the most attention would go to a face that was somewhat different from a previous face, but not too different. So this gave the rise to the discrepancy principle of Kagan. Stimuli moderately discrepant from a schema elicit longer orientations than do either minimally discrepant, familiar events, or novel events that bear no relation to the schema. So this is sort of a design principle or a creativity principle that often people will succeed by working within a set of available schemas, but varying them in ways that capture interest without causing too much confusion, if you will. And so it's an interesting thing to understand how can, in some cases, a drastic innovation become socially accepted. But that's not part of our discourse today. But that notion of how, when we do something new, how does it build on what is already familiar? And what are the limits of variation that can create something that is genuinely and interestingly new, but not so new that you lose your audience. Yeah?
So the 1 week old infant is going to pay attention to the just left hand up, that one, or both of them?
Yeah, so if you compare this and this, you're going to get more attention, more time attending to that.
What about the 4 of them? If you give the 4...
I have to confess the paper was short enough
Okay.
that I don't know what happens in that comparison. But the crucial point was, I think, that the idea was that if you have something that is more familiar, you've got a sort of an inverted U of attention from, oh, it's too familiar, I'm not interested, it's too different, I'm confused, to, oh, this is interesting, a change has occurred, let me think about it. Okay, so we've talked about episodic memory, and I think one of the most familiar findings to most people in neuroscience is this finding that we talked about last week when we contrasted the place cells in the hippocampus of the rat as possibly related to wayfinding in space, to episodic memory, which is in some sense finding your way in your past, what events occurred in the past. And we talked about poor H.M. who lost the ability when he lost his compass. But the idea is episodic memory is then the accurate recall of a single event. And what we suggested in thinking about half-forgotten memories and yet all is new from Zumthor was the idea that just recalling accurately one event is not enough. We want to understand how diverse partial memories that may be relevant come together and are amalgamated. What may seem like a flaw in a memory system, it's not that accurate, now becomes a virtue because you're putting stuff together. And how is this controlled? Well, this, to my mind, is an example of a really exciting challenge in neuroscience that can inform the conversation between neuroscience and architecture, but is intrinsically interesting to neuroscientists. And clearly, for our conversation to proceed, it must be that both the neuroscientist and the architect are getting excited about what's involved within their own fields as well as in the conversation. Let's sort of get a sense of the state of the art and suggest it hasn't gone far enough to meet the criteria I've just laid out, but definitely shows us this is a current research area. So there's a paper, I'll give you the exact reference in a moment, called The Future of Memory. Very nice. Remembering, Imagining in the Brain. And the idea is that, as we've just illustrated, you need good memory to support adaptive function. You have to know things, and you have to be able to mobilize them. And what's interesting is that when you image the brain and give tests of remembering the past versus imagining or simulating the future, there is overlap. And the question I raise, not to answer it today, but to pose it as, I think, an exciting challenge for the conversation, is how might these findings carry over to imagining a new building? So how could we understand the distributed structure of memories that support their role in imagination? So today, just a few pointers to the literature, perhaps in the future, whether in this course or elsewhere, we can show real progress. So let's take that paper. It turns out to be by Schachter in Harvard and his colleagues from 2012, The Future of Memory, Remembering, Imagining in the Brain. And they state a common brain network underlies both episodic memory and imagination. But let's be precise about this. Brain imaging shows overlap between the activated areas. And the issue then is what processes are supported in the shared region and which of these processes are deployed in concert with distinctive brain regions for episodic memory versus imagination. What's this cautionary note? It's just that brain imaging just says, very often, I'll compare two tasks. So in this case, I'll have some sort of memory task, and I'll have some sort of imagination task, and then I looked at which brain areas light up when I, in other words, have most synaptic activity, I think, have most synaptic activity when either of these tasks is compared to some neutral task or when one is compared to the other. And there's sometimes a tendency to say that if you see something coming up in one task but not the other, then it's the stuff that's activated in that does the job. But in fact, what you're doing with those tests, you're saying what areas are more active in A rather than B. So the fact that something that, so there may be many processes that are shared, and there may be many other areas that are involved, whether or not the task is being done. But for those of us interested in the details of how the brain works, the issue of what actual computations in the neural networks would support being able to retrieve a memory relevant to a context versus retrieve some aspect of a memory within an imaginative task. That's the sort of thing that interests us. What they're saying here is distinguish between temporal and non-temporal factors. What they're saying here is that trying to imagine the future, which is sort of, this is what I think will happen tomorrow, or this is what I plan to happen tomorrow, seems to use pretty much the same networks as just imagination generally. So there can be a time factor, imagine what could happen at some future date or future time, or just imagine in some unconstrained way. that seems to have roughly the same sort of activity. But what is lacking in this and other papers is a detailed account of the underlying processes. It's one thing to say, here are the brain regions that seem to be more active in let's say if we just took a pure visual task, look at this versus remember something or imagine something. The fact that there's overlap is not enough. What actually is going on? How do they come up with these tasks? So this is, for me, a very exciting current challenge. In searching the literature, I found that the work of Elinor McGuire has recently gone in this direction. Elinor is very famous for a paper in which she studied the brains of London taxi drivers who have this immense knowledge of the streets of London, and found that indeed a certain region of the hippocampus was larger in the London taxi drivers than in other people. And so that's probably her most famous paper. But recently she's been looking at hippocampus and the parahippocampal gyrus region near the hippocampus to look at imagination and episodic memory. And she's brought this notion of scenes into the work and the notion of scene construction. But she hasn't really got into, so again, it's in terms of here are some tasks, here are regions in the hippocampus, around the hippocampus that are active in these tasks, but trying to build a computational account or at the minimum a conceptual analysis of interacting processes has not yet occurred. But I would think these three papers of hers, so just search on McGuire, Elinor McGuire, in the last few years, and you can find some excellent resources for where we're at. But this slide is just to remind us of what we talked about before, that we saw, if we think about just perception, we have to realize it's not a matter of I just look at a scene and I know what it is. There is a process, even if it occurs subconsciously and in less than a second, but we look at a scene and our eyes move around and we begin to break it into parts that are candidates for interpretation, and then slowly we begin to recognize what some of the parts are, and some of them may provide context for each other. And all I'm saying is that I think that going back to the understanding of construction as part of the perceptual process may in the end help us fill in some of the gaps in the current conversation between episodic memory on the one hand and imagination on the other. And I think Elinor McGuire wants us to realize that even memory is constructive, just as we've emphasized here that perception is constructive. But because it's constructive, I think that's what will give us a handle on Zumthor's challenge of how can half-forgotten memories yield something new, because just as we saw here, the way in which the image constrains our activation up to confidence levels, if you will, of different perceptual schemas, so one can pull on different elements of memory, different episodes, to come up with what in the end will be a coherent vision or imagination, multisensory imagination of some aspect of a building. And then, of course, this is where we go from the unaided brain to the symbolic environment enriched brain, where precise drawings and text and specifications can capture stages which now become part of the external stimulation that adds to our memory to advance the design further. So we're getting some handle there on what's engaged. Okay, so I just want to spend a few slides on what I think is a disappointing theory of architectural design, which challenges us to do better in week 5. So we'll find out in a few weeks whether I can do better or not, but that's the challenge. And I must tell you, the reason I got so upset with this paper was that he uses Utzon's design of the Sydney Opera House to ground his theory, but in fact, in the initial draft, he knew it was all pure speculation. And then after I recommended the paper be rejected, he came up with a few drawings of Utzon's and scrambled them together, but did no scholarship on Utzon's actual design process. And since I grew up in Sydney with a good view of the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the site where Utzon's building would emerge after I left Sydney, that gave me a critical bias. But I was prepared to accept his theory, even though I was upset about the bad example. But I think it's still a bad theory, even if one forgives him for his treatment of Utzon. So I will call it Gold's parody of Utzon's design process, because just this one sentence is all he says in his text about the actual documentation that we have of Utzon's design. He did not begin with a blank slate. In his retrospective account of the process, he notes being inspired by memories of the Castle of Cornbury, the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, and seeing the naval charts over Sydney. That's it. And he offers no analysis of the relevance of these memories or the roles each played in developing his design. So in other words, in mentioning Utzon, he gets nothing that can be used as, in some sense, a constraint on our analysis of the design process. I should mention that, in fact, the drawings we'll see on the next slide, most of them are in a very nice book that was one of my major resources in putting this material together, by Françoise Romaneau, called Jørn Utzon, the Sydney Opera House. So let's just look at his figure, and then later we will come back to a more sophisticated appreciation. So this is the one figure. Well, actually, there are a couple of other even worse figures, but this is his figure in which it sort of goes like this. Here are Utzon's sketches of clouds and pagodas and so on, and this inspires this. He even puts in this wretched thing of having humping turtles as being the inspiration for the shells of the Opera House. He repeats the idea that maybe it was sails that did it. He then puts in these rough sketches to suggest that there's a process of refinement here, and then he comes to these detailed drawings, which he claims followed this, but in fact, as we'll see, this is an unfounded caricature of what went into Utzon's design, but further, the order of the elements as he shows them do not relate to the actual design. So let me just briefly note what he said. I think I'll skip this particular slide, and I'll skip this slide to just say that his theory that he offers is based on the distinction between vague representations and precise representations. So, for example, he considers a conceptual sketch to be vague, imprecise, abstract, ambiguous, indeterminate, and then he talks about lateral transformations which broaden the problem of space. In other words, you have an idea and you move it to a slightly different idea. So that's a little bit like the disparity principle idea. You've got something and you transform it a bit. But he's doing this at the level of things that are ambiguous and imprecise. And then he contrasts this with precise, concrete, unambiguous things like the contract documents that you would deliver at the end of the design process. And he talks about inference processes that look at vertical transformations, which is where you fill in more and more details. And on this basis, he suggests that, in fact, the processing of vague representations is carried out by the right prefrontal cortex. The processing of precise representations is carried out by the left prefrontal cortex. And in justice to him, I should say that the paper does survey a body of interesting neuropsychological literature, but I think that the literature he surveys doesn't allow one to make this simplistic left-right hemisphere analysis, and that we really have to get into more detail. So, for example, just emphasizing the two hemispheres doesn't get us into any of the considerations we've already had, anything about the hippocampus, regions near the hippocampus, the challenges of relating memory and imagining and so on. And finally, for this blast of negativity. He looks at 3 phases. The problem scoping, where we start with an open-ended problem, bring in the designer's world, knowledge, goals, aspirations, and so on. And he admits this process is poorly understood. So what we'll be trying to do is to look at Utzon and say, well, if instead of just coming up with a scrambled diagram of a few drawings, and we really try to look in some detail, we can begin to get a sense of this problem scoping and framing. Then preliminary solution generation comes up with a few ideas and explored through lateral transformations. And what we'll be showing by contrast is part of the early stages of the design require precise decisions, which then must be filled in, but it's not a matter of coming up with something vague and just modulating it. So it's not so much just having one vague idea and modifying it to something slightly different. Various aha moments will be needed to both vague and precise to collide to yield genuinely new ideas. And some of Zumthor's ideas fit in with that. And then finally his idea, you've got this solution which is vague, and then you fill in the details. And I'll leave that at that, because in the time we have available, I'd really like to just take us through a discussion of Jørn Utzon's design of the Sydney Opera House, where in fact we're not going to get deeply into the cognitive neuropsychology or neuroscience of his design, but we're rather going to try to get an assessment of how one might analyze an individual's design process to have, in a sense, a set of data points against which a particular cognitive theory of design could be tested. And of course, as time goes by and more people work to develop a better theory and work to develop more clearly articulated case studies of this kind, so the process will go forward, both in terms of more insight into architecture, more challenges for the neuroscience. So here is Jørn Utzon, and here are 2 views of the Sydney Opera House sitting on Sydney Harbour. And so what we want to do, as I say, is try to understand the knowledge and memories that inform the design of the Opera House. And I have to give you some analysis of what Utzon knew and when he knew it. And as I say, although there were many different resources, Fromeneux's book was a very important one. So let's look first at the competition, because we start with the Premier of New South Wales, Joe Carl, feeling that Sydney needed a very distinctive opera house. They chose a particular place just below the harbour bridge called Bennelong Point. And the program, so I stress that for an architect, a program is basically the general specification of what a building is to be, whereas for a computer scientist, the program is the fine details that actually execute the specifications. So just to stress that the program here is just saying, let's build on this site, Bennelong Point on Sydney Harbour, which is, they claim, probably without equal in the world. It fulfills all the requirements, dimension, space, and beauty, essential for the type of building that should be constructed. But this program was in fact unusually flexible. It didn't provide many details beyond build it on Bennelong Point, except we need 2 auditoriums, we need rehearsal rooms, we need a broadcasting center, a restaurant, 2 meeting rooms, as well as bars and foyers. And the brief did not call for too much detail. So we need line drawings. The competitors can come up with that. We don't want any color. We don't want you to submit models. So the constraints were very loose. So what I'm going to do is try and, forgive me for having so many words here, we're going to offer a retrospective look at the design process. So clearly, I think each building of this magnitude could invite multiple iterations as the first pass on what we need to know to look at the mental processes, combines with our developing theory that then challenges historians of architecture to come back and fill in the gaps to create more challenges. So anyway, what's interesting is he didn't visit the site prior to the start of the competition. He had no knowledge of Sydney. He had to gather his own documentation to complement the photographs and the 2 plans reproduced in the competition handbook. At the Australian Embassy in Copenhagen, he watched the only available film there on Sydney, hard to believe. And in this he observed the clouds that lingered over the bay, which he said had inspired him to think of white roofs floating over the platform. But, so here, while many people, including Girl, talk about the sails of yachts on Sydney Harbour as the inspiration for the shells, here Utzon is talking about clouds, but I'm going to argue that this is only one aspect, not just clouds that inspired him. And then another important point was that his father was a marine architect and ran a big shipyard. So he sailed a lot in Denmark. So this experience as someone who knew a different body of water but knew it very well and knew about boats very well was an important part. So by getting maritime charts, he, as an experienced navigator, could measure distances and form a judgment of heights, the importance of the color of the sea and the shades of light. And so this was based on his general experience of the sea, not on what was in the competition handbook. So this photograph takes us back to Bennelong Point. So I've got, here's a picture of the point as seen from the harbour bridge. Here's the harbour bridge as seen from Bennelong Point. At this time, just before the competition was announced, Bennelong Point was no longer really a place for ships to dock, but was used as a tram depot. So this is the site. And the important point from here is that, okay, there's a specific shape of that point, which may or may not be factored into the design, and that there is this special vantage for the point from the harbour bridge. So here are the 3 top buildings. So this is number 3. So the auditoriums are in 2 separate buildings. And basically the design doesn't in some sense respect the shape of Bennelong Point. It imposes these 2 buildings on Bennelong Point. The second design was, actually if it had been built, it would have been still, I think, a very successful building. It sort of had this central core which was provided the stage machinery for both stages, for both auditorium, and then wrapped the 2 auditoria and the other buildings around this central core for the stage machinery. But Utzon came in with this design which just caught the imagination in the end, thanks in part to Eero Saarinen, who we'll meet later, caught the imagination of the jury after initially being ignored, and won the competition. And what's very interesting about this design, which distinguished it from the others, is on the one hand it's very sketchy, but there were more details provided, and you'll notice what he's done is he has decided to put the auditorium side by side and to, in some sense, respect the land, the footprint. The footprint of the building pretty much coincides with the footprint of Bennelong Point. So it's interesting. I think a very good loser, Robert Geddes, who was a member of the Philadelphia group which won second prize, said, "We almost won, but we didn't. Why? Because Jørn Utzon's design was a masterpiece." So, okay. How did he get to that point? What happened afterwards? So here I note that the jury, in finally giving the first prize to Utzon, said the unity of its structural expression creates a striking architectural composition admirably suited to Bennelong Point. The white sail-like forms of the shell vaults relate as naturally to the harbour as sails to yachts. Fine, but I just draw this to sort of say, yeah, but sails and shells are really quite different creatures. And so was there another inspiration? I don't think the shapes were inspired by sails so much as the hulls of boats. What then were the images that came to mind, to repeat Zumthor's phrase? So a little detour. In off-camera discussions, we looked at the way in which what other architects are doing can provide part of the framework in which the individual architect works, so that when those ideas are coming to mind, it's not just what you yourself has experienced directly, but your understanding and experience of the work of other architects. So in Fromino's book that I've mentioned a couple of times, she writes the following: at the beginning of the 1950s, there was a marked loss of momentum in the heroic ideals of modernism. And we're going to see in a moment that Mies van der Rohe had the Seagram building, which was a beautiful expression of modernism. But other people were drifting in two directions. The international standardization of Miesian sublimity, in other words, a lot of people were doing what Mies had done, but not doing it as well. It became rather mass-produced. And then a search for greater individual expression inspired by forms and references that had been sidelined. So, in her opinion, the Seagram building, which we'll show you in a moment, is a masterpiece in that style here of prismatic buildings, but at the same time, Le Corbusier had just built the Ronchamp Chapel, Wright had just built the Guggenheim Museum in New York, Alvar Aalto, the greatest of the Finnish architects, has begun his work on the Imatra Church. So she's saying that if we are looking for influence in terms of other architects, it's a clear rejection of this style, but it's certainly a conversation with the style of these architects. So let's just look quickly at some of these examples to frame the discussion. So here is the Seagram building on Fifth Avenue in New York, which, with its clean modern lines, its use of copper coloring, the color of the windows and so on, is a masterpiece. And I remember when I first saw it, being struck by that, 58. But look how different Corbusier, this is, the early Corbusier was much more straight lines and so on. But in 1954, he created this chapel with suggestive of the roof, suggestive of the wimple of a nun, the headgear, the curling headgear of a nun in traditional garb. Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum opened in 1959 and is amazing for the way in which the gallery swirls downward. And then Alvar Aalto has this church, the Imatra Church, with again this move away from the straight line and towards the curve. So we can see that, to use our language analogy, we can see that there was a vocabulary beginning to be put in place, very distinctive from the modernism that culminated perhaps with Mies van der Rohe. Another thing, though, and we talked about this in terms of construction, is that not only was there a new vocabulary in terms of thinking about buildings, but there was a new set of construction techniques. And so, for the first time, these huge expanses of concrete could be built. Wooden frames would be built, and then the concrete would be formed on top of it. So we have Nowicki's Raleigh Stadium, Raleigh, North Carolina, and then we have this TWA terminal that opened in 1957, but the general plan was already known to architects, including Utzon at the time of the competition, where we see this, the fine curves of the shell, and I believe it was derelict for many years and is now being turned into a hotel. But having been a customer there in the early years, there was just such a playfulness of the interior design as well as the amazing swoops of the exterior design that this was indeed an influential masterpiece. Okay, but we're talking general context. So let's now try and penetrate more into the head of the architect, and there is a website called the Guide to Utzon, www.utzonphotos.com, and then from that we get to About Utzon, get to the biography, and there's an essay there in which he talks about his father, who, as we said, was a master shipbuilder amongst other skills. So Utzon says, I have benefited greatly from the many hours I spent with my father attached to a large shipyard where all trades were represented and large-scale work was carried out. So he said, when I was about to draw the Opera House in Sydney, I was not really worried that I had to convert sketches into curved surfaces towering 60 meters, define them geometrically, and have them constructed. As a child, I had seen huge ship hulls. And it seems to me that looking at this, the curves on either side of the hull with the keel providing this line that divides the two halves brings us much closer to the shells of the Sydney Opera House than a sail or a cloud does, though each of them may well have been part of the subliminal images. Now, the tragedy for Utzon was in some sense that the competition was so generously underspecified that he didn't have to say how are you going to build the shells. And that even though he shared Zumthor's respect for the art of joining, the ability of craftsmen and engineers, he hadn't thought through the challenges of going from the wooden hull of a ship or the metal hull of a ship to massive concrete shells. And that proved, as we'll see in a while, to be his undoing. So, I mentioned at the beginning that there is a documentary on TV called Sydney Opera House Man-Made Marvels. I think it's from about 2008, released by something called 7 Mate. I think that means it was on Channel 7 in Sydney when it was first released. And it just follows through that idea that the winning proposal lacked many of the details. So John Nutt, who was a structural engineer on the project, said, yeah, so we saw the Novicki Stadium, the Saarinen TWA terminal had each employed these massive concrete shells. But those shells were shaped in a way that the then current technology knew, but then current technology could support, as distinct from the sharp ridge line. And so the radical shapes construction bordered on the near impossible 50 years ago at the time. The sails curve up to 20 stories high, each would hold its own weight. The ridge lines posed another problem. Concrete shells don't like sharp ridge lines. And for 3 years, various solutions failed. In the end, although it's suggested that Utzon came up with a conceptual solution related to peeling an orange, the working out how to build these things was the engineering firm of Arbib, A-R-U-P, that really solved that problem. So this goes back to that passing mention of that if we really want to understand design, we have this notion of co-designers. Who is responsible for what? How can they communicate so that they, between them, come up with the final coherent design? Now, Joe Carl was the prime minister who had initiated the competition. But in 1958, he was up for re-election, likely to lose, and he was really concerned that if construction didn't start, the whole project would be cancelled by the new government that succeeded his. So he insisted that the project start, even though the problem with the shells had not yet been solved, so that it couldn't be cancelled by his opponent. So the construction engineer, Malcolm Nicklin, said, hey, you need a carefully planned base design. Should I start my Sydney accent? to support the sails, yet only freehand sketches of the sails were available. Yet on March 2nd, 59, construction started before the plans were final. Design developed as they were building. Well, see the video to learn a lot more about this, and in particular, because things were so protracted and the cost was rising so dramatically, the new government was withdrawing its support, and so Utzon offered his resignation to try and shock them into coming up with what was needed for him to realize his design, but instead they accepted his resignation. And so the exterior of the building is Utzon's idea. The general access to the auditoriums is Utzon's idea, but the interior had to be carried through by local architects. And the tragedy is that Utzon never saw his building. He never came back to Sydney after the resignation. He never saw that, and it became a World Heritage Site, but he never saw it. Okay, so what I want to do in the last few minutes we have together is just to take you through what I think are some of the key design features. And what's interesting about these design features, to me, is rather than that idea of just having vague ideas and finally filling in details, which I think was Goel's idea, we see there are some very clear, symbolically precise decisions that were made, and then the sketching and the working out of detail could follow from that. But it wasn't that there was this vague lateral thinking first and then precise thinking following. So the first very interesting idea was that Utzon really thought about how the Opera House would be seen from the different perspectives on the harbour, from the botanical gardens up here, and from the harbour bridge. Whereas the other architects had all just thought, how am I going to build a really neat opera house on land of this acreage? So that was a crucial high-level decision. The building would be visible from all sides. That's important, but also had to take into account the overlooking views, Botanical Gardens, Sydney Harbour Bridge. And so the other competitors failed on that. So this is one design feature. It's not vague at all. It's very precise, but it's at a high level, literally from the bridge, but metaphorically as well. So in thinking about the view from the harbour, Jørn Utzon was very much influenced by his experience as a lad sailing near Helsingør, which is sort of the area that Shakespeare was thinking of in terms of Hamlet's castle. And so here's this castle, sailing around it. Here's the castle from the air on this peninsula, jutting into the Sound. This is Denmark. Very close over here is Sweden. So he was struck by similarities in terms of the forms stand out in a horizontal line, the sea and the clouds without a single vertical line, whatever that means. But his analysis of the specifics of the Sydney site were reinforced by evocation of familiar places, and again sort of Zumthor forms charged with poetic memory. But the buildings are so different, and the fifth facade that is so important in relating this peninsula Bennelong Point to its building is very different from the peninsula and the flat surroundings there. But again, this does take us back to the original Zumthor point of old memories come to mind and yet all is new. That the old memories of sailing around Helsingør add that component of the fifth facade of the harbour bridge, and now you have a new framework that yet is evoking in part the memories of the castle. So I haven't renumbered my principles on these slides, but design principle 5 I've already mentioned was the placement of the auditoriums. That we said that if we look at the top three entries One was to just place the auditoriums as separate buildings on the site. Another was to unify the two buildings through a shared core for the stage machinery. And Utzon's solution was that unique one of putting them side by side. And very importantly, he wasn't just saying, okay, I'm making a footprint. And this is sort of the form function and the diversity of functions. So he was saying that for me, the opera house, one of the functions obviously is to have good auditoriums to stage the various productions. But it's on Sydney Harbour, and so in addition to looking in, how will people see the opera house from different perspectives, there's looking out. And so in fact, if you look at the design, each auditorium, you have to go up a slope obviously to get to higher and higher seats, but then you actually come out at the back of the auditorium and you are now in a large foyer with huge glass windows looking out over the harbour. So that idea of both by this design of putting the auditorium side by side, he was not only inspired by the footprint of the point, but he was also inspired by adding to the functionality of the auditoriums for performance, the idea that the foyers should be placed to optimize the experience of the wonderful scenery of Sydney Harbour. So that's the idea there. So we've already talked about this and conforming to the design of the site, so we don't need to go that in detail, but I think it's interesting to just look at these two photographs, two aerial photographs side by side. Here's Bennelong Point back in its tram shed days, and now here is the Sydney Opera House today. And you see the placement here with the promenades around, the views out here onto the harbour, the restaurant that can look over to the side there, the botanical gardens behind. So you see how just the use of the site and this notion that, okay, you paid a price that competitor number 2 didn't pay, in that you've got to duplicate the machinery, but competitor number 3 had to do that. But you're really using the site and you're thinking about the function, not only in terms of this is an opera house, but also this is a place to experience Sydney and its harbour and the magnificent views that are around there. So another thing that's interesting is the design of the opera house. If you remember, there's a platform on the point, and then the shelves rise above the platform. And what's strange, if you're thinking of relating form to function, is that in some sense, let's just go back. If we go back here, there's there's the size and the width reflects this is where the auditorium is, this is the entrance, but beyond those very loose constraints of size, there's really nothing auditoria-ish, to use a word, about the shells. So that separation, that's sort of interesting, the separation of the platform, the functional part of the building, and the non-functional floating roof, if you like. So that's the design principle. A platform containing the hidden workings, I'm sorry. Okay, so he dissociates the roof from what it sheltered, and then he could with relatively loose constraints, think about how to model the auditoriums. As we've said, one of the tragedies was he was fired before he actually got to exploit his ideas about the auditoriums. But the roofs became a fifth facade, his building a sculpture. The massive base on which the shells rested was absolutely horizontal, responding to the water and the plateaus of the botanical gardens. What images have come to mind? And, this does fit in with the sentence and one fragment of Goel's figure, and that is his experience of Chinese temples and Mayan influences came here. That the temple, the Chinese temple, as shown here, a typical example, you have a platform, you have roofs which are distinctive, and then the building in between is not particularly constrained or constraining of the roof. And then the platforms here for the Chichen Itza Observatory and so on. So these were part of what came to mind. And in a paper that he published some years after he won the competition, we have this combination, and a fraction of this was sort of item one in Goel's figure, where we have the clouds floating above the horizon, the pagoda roof floating above its platform without constraining what you'll put underneath it, and variations on that theme became the inspiration. So clouds floating over the sea to the Opera House was his sketches in his 1962 essay, Platforms and Pagodas, which, as I say, comes long after the competition had been won. But if we look at this, it's hard to see the Opera House shells in these sketches, and this is where I bring back one of his father's boats, and I turn it through 90 degrees to suggest that this shape with the keel sharply dividing the two sides is, to my mind, a better inspiration to add to this general floating. So, as Zumthor says, all is new and there is no direct reference to a former work of architecture. And I think at this stage I can skip. Oh, let me just take one more of the design principles, which I think is interesting because it links back to our discussion last time about affordances. So, Utzon explained, the architecture emphasizes the character of Bennelong Point and takes the greatest advantage of the view. So we already saw that. The idea of the building is not just to be seen as the building, but the vantage point it provides with those foyers at the ends of the auditoria to see the world around. And then he really thinks about what we might call it as affordances. The approach of the audience is easy and is distinctly pronounced as in Grecian theatres by uncomplicated staircase construction. So he's got this, the audience is assembled from cars, trains and ferries and led like a festive procession into the respective halls thanks to the pure staircase solution. So there really is the idea that, okay, once you know which of the left or the right auditorium to go to, the architecture leads you up. And then you know that if you keep going, at that time or during the intermission, you will be in this area where you can relax with this amazing view. So in the end, as I've said, Utzon was deprived of the design of the auditoriums, but I think we've seen how neuroscience, or at least cognitive science, can enter into dialogue with a deeper understanding of the processes of architectural design. And so that's where we'll leave it for today and come back to this theme in week 5 after talking next time about atmospheres and then talking about emotion and empathy in relating humans and buildings in the 4th of our lectures.